I am Amanda Knowles. I am a part-time teacher here, and I run the art gallery on campus. So that's why I am here in this distinguished spot to introduce our visiting artist, Amanda Salov.
Yeah.
Okay. Before I begin, I want to be sure that we acknowledge that we are on native land. Important thing to do. So it is my honor to introduce Amanda Salov to you. Amanda was raised in rural Wisconsin. This was something that was written on her bio, and I couldn't get rid of it because I've spent some time in Wisconsin, so I just needed it to be there.
Oh, I'll talk more about that for sure.
She received her BFA from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater and her MFA from the University of Missouri-Columbia, both with an emphasis in ceramics. Amanda has shown her work throughout the United States. She has spent time working at Anderson Ranch Center in Snowmass Village, Colorado, University of Arkansas, Oregon College of Art and Craft in Portland, Oregon, the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramics Arts in Helena, Montana, Watershed Center for the Ceramic Arts in Newcastle, Maine, the University of Washington, Oregon State University in the microbiology department, and Tainan National University of the Arts in Taiwan. These are residencies, visiting artist stints, and spells in places. She has been named an NSC Emerging Artist. She was twice awarded the Oregon Arts Council grant. She twice received a Ford Family Foundation Career Opportunity Grant, as well as other fellowships and grants. She is taught as a visiting faculty member at the University of Washington, Lynn Benton Community College in Corvallis, Oregon, as well as Pottery Northwest, Oregon State University, Archie Bray Foundation, University of Arkansas, University of Missouri. She is currently a long-term resident at Pottery Northwest in Queen Anne. If you don't know about this spot, they have some really good stuff there, including Amanda. And she just took down a solo show at Sierra Nevada College in Incline Village, Nevada, and has work in a show that ends tomorrow at the North Seattle College Art Gallery. In Working Relationship is what the show is called. So please welcome me. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Salov. Should I turn off lights?
Sure. Thank you so much, Amanda. I feel so supported in having my work here. It was great to be invited, but then Amanda even came down to Pottery Northwest and picked up my artwork. She was willing to do anything to help me, which is great. So my work examines the quality of a moment. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that clay in and of itself as a material responds to touch. And when you fire it, it freezes that moment. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background and what has led me to where I am right now, making these weird things I make. Can you guys hear me okay? Oh, awesome. So I'm from rural Wisconsin. This is what my backyard looked like as a kid. Looks like still. My parents still live here. This is me with my two siblings. We would constantly be playing outside in the dirt. I remember losing shoes to this field in the mud, playing in the creek, and then investigating our neighbors. And our neighbors lived, maybe like half a mile away in all directions. I had a neighbor that was a mechanic, a neighbor that was a farmer, and a neighbor that was a potter. And us children were drawn to these different people and their occupations, and so I was really drawn to the potters. So this potter on the right, Peter Jackson, he moved in when I was 2 years old, and so I've known pottery my entire life. And my hometown is actually a pottery town. There were 2 factories back in the 80s when I was growing up. And so people would come from all over the country to work at these factories to do production work. And then they would save enough money and have their own studios and often branch out. So I grew up like with half a dozen wood kilns in my neighborhood. And I kind of thought that was normal. So I knew from an early age that I wanted to work in ceramics, specifically pottery, and I chose Whitewater, Wisconsin, because they had a decent program, but mostly because my grandparents lived there. It was about 30 minutes from my parents' house, and it was like really branching out and going far from home for me, which is interesting to look back on now. So I love this image. So this is when I was a teenager, back in the 90s. It's not such a crazy picture because I think people are starting to wear baggy pants like this again, actually. But the special thing about my grandpa was that we had a really close bond, but he was also mostly blind. But we would have these long conversations and long walks holding onto each other's arms and kind of pointing at the details that we would come across. And I love this capture because it was when always talking to him, he would like zone in on a thing. And he wasn't really able to see it. And so I credit him with like teaching me how to see, but not with my eyes. Like, so to engage with the world with my other senses. So it was actually soon after I started college that my grandpa died. So then I was at Whitewater, 30 minutes from my parents' house, without my grandparents. So my grandpa died, and then my grandma had pretty severe Alzheimer's that was kind of hidden by him taking care of her. So then she was moved to a home, and so then I was just in Whitewater, far from home. I know, not really, but it felt like it was. So I spent all my time in the ceramics studio, and very soon after my grandpa died, Charlie Olson, my professor there, became like my mentor, and he's still my mentor, #1 teacher. And so this is his work. Super attention to detail. Definitely some overlaps with my grandpa. And then while I was in undergraduate school, this guy came as a visiting artist. And I was so drawn to his work, not necessarily that I wanted my work to look like it, but I saw it as like a physical manifestation of poetry. And so I wanted to learn from him. It's funny talking about these things because every time you talk about them, you like remember, you think of new things. But like all 3 of these men in my life were like grumpy old men. And so like I went from one grumpy old man to another grumpy old man to another grumpy old man. So just pointing that out. So once I got to graduate school though, I stretched away from that. I met my other graduate professor, David East, and he was young, and he really challenged me on my ideas. He was gone the first semester that I was there, and he came back, and we had a graduate show up, and I had these things up in the show, and he was like, "This is not graduate level work," and I was just like devastated. And so then I was drawn to him as a challenger. He really helped to push my work. I also started learning that, okay, this is gonna sound crazy, but I wasn't exposed to a lot of female artists growing up, or art teachers. And like, I still never had a ceramics teacher that was female. So I was exposed finally in graduate school to Eva Hess. These felt very bodily, the materials. And then the idea that these materials, like she used early plastics and resins, and she was totally invested in her work, and she actually died an early death, probably from her exposure to these materials. Wolfgang Leib, he actually collects pollen throughout the seasons and then makes these color fields. Cy Twombly. So it was at this point in graduate school that I was looking outside of just pottery and outside of just ceramics for more inspiration. I started making these ceramic pillows. Oh, I should go back. Before I went to graduate school, like my portfolio was all pottery. And so it's hard for people to believe when they look at my work now that the foundation is pots, but it totally is. So I started thinking about how we as humans are only here for a short amount of time and temporal. And so these were just like super early sculptural forms. I started collaborating with another grad student who was a painter. She was taking like all of these feminist theory classes. And so we had the opportunity to make an installation. This is my first installation in a bowl pen where they would auction off bowls. So these are water balloons dipped in plaster, and then like half of them we would take a probe or whatever and release the water, so then they would just be like these beautiful shells of something that once was. So I got really lost in graduate school. I started experimenting with all sorts of materials that were not clay. You can see one of these plaster sets of balls on the top, where it became the shell of the thing. And I was also exposed to this poem. So I'm going to share a few poems with you guys throughout this talk, but and this really pushed my work into this other territory. But because truly being here is so much, because everything here apparently needs us, this fleeting world, which in some strange way keeps calling to us the most fleeting of all. Once for each thing, just once, no more. And we too, just once, completely, even if only once, to have been at one with the earth seems beyond undoing. And that's from Rilke. And so with that, you know, kind of releasing yourself to kind of be in the present and aware and not distracted or whatever, it kind of gives me like this anxious feeling. So I think this don't panic is perfectly appropriate. So I started making this kind of work. And so those forms, that bulbous form, where it was a water balloon and then another material and dipped in plaster, I started actually doing that with porcelain. And so it was a new way of making, a new process invented through this experimentation. I also started working with beeswax and sugar, and thinking about like what their properties, how their properties fed into those ideas. So sugar was like this super solid liquid, so it was changing slowly, and then the wax was like an idea of preservation. And I wanted the porcelain to kind of live in this world between like a bone and an ash. It was super, super thin and fragile. And so you can see all of that culminating in this sculpture. And this was the first sculpture where it got into some like prestigious national juried exhibitions, and we had a visiting artist who was like, that's on track, and so it's interesting. It's those moments that kind of propel you forward in your studio, and you don't feel so alone or lost or that you're on the wrong direction. So that was good and helpful. So this is actually fat and udon noodles. So super pushing that idea of what can be temporal and what can be art. This is porcelain, sugar, wax. And then this is just 2 different kinds of clay. And it's the idea of I had this dream that I was like on the top of a giant redwood tree, kind of not knowing how to get down, being terrified from being so high, but needing to kind of go to the next whatever. And this was right at the end of graduate school. So this is the work that came from that, kind of being on a ledge. So I left the graduate school while my thesis show was still up, and I went to Anderson Ranch. I had been accepted to do a residency there, but then invited early to work in the sculpture department as a summer assistant. So I was there. It was interesting. I was told at that point that I was a sculptor, and what I learned is that I make sculptures from ceramics and other materials influenced by ceramics, but I'm not a sculpture person. I'm a ceramic person. I did all the things, but the language was just different. But I did meet some great people. So Eric Olander, he was just this kid, but he was really great. He was 18 or 19 years old, and a few years earlier he had actually dropped out of high school to become a full-time studio artist. And he was at Anderson Ranch on scholarship for a class, a sculpture class. And we actually asked him to stay and assist with the rest of the classes for the summer. Great energy. He now lives in New York, and he's been featured in the New York Times and Washington Post, and he has a project called Mirrors of Craigslist, where it's a whole collection of the images on from Mirrors of Craigslist. Okay, so while I was at Anderson Ranch, I got my scholarship package for my residency, and this was back in 2007. And with my scholarship, it was going to be $1,400 a month to do that residency in Aspen, Colorado, like very expensive place to be. And so I was kind of a little bit nervous and panicking, and like I had just finished graduate school, and I was serious, and I had worked all summer assisting these sculpture classes, and my studio time was just like little bits every night. In any case, I got a phone call about a job, like just a few weeks to the end of the summer. And the woman called me because she was looking for somebody last minute because her resident technician adjunct professor had like backed out just before school started. And someone thought that I might know someone because I'm in this hub of artists who might need something. Just like a couple of sentences into it, I was like, well, actually, I might be interested. I might bail on this thing because this is kind of crazy to think I would pay so much. And just a few weeks later, when the summer was over, I was driving to Arkansas. It was really crazy. I never thought I would move more south than Missouri. So while in Arkansas, I spent a lot of time teaching and fixing things and whatever, but I would give myself assignments. So I started making lemons when I was at Anderson Ranch. I would make wax lemons and porcelain lemons, and I had this friend that had a gallery in Arkansas, and she let me do the monthly window installations. And so she had like an encaustic show. So this is a little sculpture display that I made in her window. But it just kept my practice going. And I think it's a big adjustment when you leave school and you don't have somebody challenging you or questioning what you're doing, to kind of figure out where your own comments for the work can come in. So this is a detail. And it took me years to realize that this was a ceramic thing to do, to cast wax hollow. This is the way that you would cast ceramics. But it just felt naturally like the way it should be. Okay, so then so here's Arkansas, and the most special thing about Arkansas is I learned to fish, and I learned about the natural environment there. It was the first like wide river I'd ever seen that I could see through. In Wisconsin, like the rivers are all muddy bottomed, and you don't swim in the rivers because it's all agriculture. And in Arkansas, they actually had the first preserved national riverway. And so this is us fishing in one of these spots. And I did make some work there. This is some of the first early tube work. But there came a point where I felt really like, what am I doing with my life? I had never decided that I was going to become a teacher straight away. And so I felt like isolated in the middle of the country. I felt, this was 2008, like right around the economic crash. It was a really crazy time because all the jobs evaporated, and I had this job, but what I really wanted to be doing is like developing my work and my own voice post-graduate school. I finished graduate school at 27, and then I went into this like university thing. I mean, so just a year after I was no longer the tech or the resident, the woman I worked with went on sabbatical, and she asked me to replace her. And then when she came back, she became the chair. And so then I was running the ceramics. And so my work just kind of like went further and further and further back burner. And I felt like I hadn't become myself yet. I felt like those old men were still in my work. But this is the work that I was making at that point. And so these were all about like shipwrecks and kind of feeling out there. And so, yeah, it's interesting. I should have put this before that other slide. So we'll go straight to this one. So does anyone know what these are? Okay, I'll tell you what they are. So after 4 years of being in Arkansas, and I actually fell in love during that time, and the guy that I fell in love with, he was from Arkansas. He was from Northwest Arkansas. He had decided he wanted to get a PhD. We had decided we were going to get married. And so I was going to leave this job. We were going to get married. And 2 months before all of this happened, my mom was like rushed to the emergency room. And we didn't really know what was happening. It was like a middle of the night kind of call. And what it ended up being was that she had a dissected aorta. Does anyone know what that means?
Doesn't sound good.
It's crazy. It's what happens when somebody instantly dies in a car accident, because the steering wheel hits their chest and their aorta disconnects from their heart, like unplugs. But sometimes when you're older and maybe you haven't taken quite such good care of yourself, it can wear out and it can leak. And so that was what was happening with her. And it has a 90% fatality rate. And so I actually got up to Wisconsin in less than 12 hours on an airplane when I got the phone call, because we were pretty sure she was not going to make it. So I got in, and I was in the ICU, which I had never been in, and she was full of saline, and I was just like super shocked. And it was kind of like this moment where the whole world for me changed. Like I understood that we don't live forever, but there was this moment where it was just like so real there. In any case, I started talking to her, and later she told me that that's what brought her out of being. She could hear what was going on, but she didn't know what had happened. She had no memory of what had happened. And we were communicating, and she was on a ventilator. The ventilator was like making her really hot and dry, and her mouth would get sores, and it would be so dry. And so these sponges, I was allowed to put it in a cup with an ice cube and make it really cold, and maybe sponge up and pick up a drop of water, and I could put it in her mouth. And she would like desperately ask me for that, and I would give it to her, and then that one little drop of water that sponge would pick up would trickle down her throat. And you can't cough with a ventilator. And so then she would try to cough, and it was like she was choking. But then, 30 minutes later, she would ask for that again because her mouth would be so sore. So it was this crazy moment. And then I went, when they said that she was going to be okay and she was going to be moved upstairs for recovery, I was able to go back home to Arkansas. And I finished this piece. And this piece is so weird because I have no idea what it is. It's a show that I had to be in, and I had started making these sweet gumballs dipped in porcelain. And I had also started making these boats, and I had a perfectly good idea of what it was going to be, but then after this happened and the whole world was different, I didn't remember where I was with this thing. So I just put it up. Okay. And then my mom was on her way to recovering, and my husband and I got married, and my mother could be there, and that was part of like the carrot in front of her, like do all these things that they're telling you to do because then you can come to our wedding. And then my husband and I moved to Oregon so that he could work with quorum sensing. And this is a little bobtail squid. It's the size of your thumbnail. It's teeny tiny. It lives off the coast of Hawaii. And it's a really interesting creature. He doesn't work with the bobtail squid, but it's a great explanation of what quorum sensing is. So there's a symbiotic relationship a beneficial relationship that this squid has with a certain microbe. And what it does for the microbe is it gives it a body to reproduce. And so the microbes, reproduce is probably not the right word, duplicate. It gives the microbes a body to duplicate. So all day while the squid is resting, the microbes can duplicate and duplicate and duplicate and duplicate and duplicate. And then at night, when the squid is out hunting and perhaps being hunted, once the microbes hit a quorum, or a certain amount of them, they can act together and light up the underside of the squid, making it camouflaged. So if the underside is lit up, it matches the moonlight from above. And then on the top of its body, it's matching the darkness from below. And then after the evening is over, it expels all of these microbes so they can be out into the open ocean and maybe picked up by other squid. And the squid retains some and maybe takes on a few others and copies and copies and copies and copies and copies, and it keeps going. So my husband works with how does that communication happen? And so that actually became a big influence in my work, and these numbers and how these numbers work together. We also started going to the Oregon coast a lot, which is such luxury, and playing with sea anemones, which I'd never seen before growing up in Wisconsin and Missouri and Arkansas and Colorado, you know. And I didn't know what to do after my mom was in the hospital and I got married and I quit that job. So I just gave myself another assignment, which I often do when I move to a new place. And so I started making a lot of funnels and filters. The idea of what just happened and what can how can I process this? Yeah, I feel like that image is kind of weird on this. Okay. We started collecting mushrooms, going to the forest, and abundance was the thing about the West that I hadn't encountered before. So this is the first time that I had my own studio away from an institution. Let me check on the time. Okay. And I had a 200 square foot room off from my house. And I just started experimenting. So my mom's favorite flower is actually Queen Anne's lace. And so I started dipping those into my liquid clay. And this is one of the sculptures that came from that. I feel like this is where I finally resolved the piece that I had started before I needed to race up to Wisconsin. And so it took me a couple of years to resolve it. That happened back in 2011, and this installation was 2013. And it's called Drift. And my body is just there to give you a scale. And then they're made up of all these little seed pods that have been dipped in the porcelain. And then I had the opportunity to make an installation at NSC in the convention hall. And I based it on this Emily Dickinson poem, To Make a Prairie. To make a prairie, it takes a clover and one bee. One clover and a bee, and reverie. The reverie alone will do if bees are few. And so the conference was in Wisconsin, so I had the opportunity to use this boat that I had been wanting to use, and I felt like me figuring out that old lemon piece that hadn't been resolved. This is a process shot, and I called this series the Reverie series. And it was all about kind of figuring these things out, being wrapped up in the process and letting the process be the filter. And so these are the pieces that you had in your gallery. Okay. Yeah, this is a little out of order. Okay, so I had the opportunity to work at the University of Washington. So this is just what I wanted. When I decided I needed to leave Arkansas, it was because I didn't get my chance to do residencies after graduate school. I didn't get the chance to really push the work and follow the work. And so upon leaving Arkansas, I got to do all of these other things. I got to go to all of these other places, like Montana for the Archie Bray, and then other places as well. But this is when I was at the University of Washington, which is like a pressure cooker over there. And I got a little studio space, and I was only there for, I don't know, January to April. I taught a class, and I just got to work in my studio. I had my dog with me, and my husband was in Oregon. So this is in your gallery, right? Mm-hmm. So this didn't get resolved for another few years too. So these again were the water balloons, and then covered in the smaller tubes. The tubes shrunk down where they're almost like beads, but I still call them tubes. And then I'll poke them, and the water will rush out. So I made an installation in the gallery that they have at the university. And I wanted it to feel, so this is a view of the ceiling. And so about halfway up, these strings, so the strings are wax nylon, and then halfway up, I tied them to tarred nylon, and so they would just disappear. There was a whole line where they just disappeared, and it followed the shape of that roof. And I wanted them to just feel like they were swinging, and they stopped. And I can take all the images, but to really understand an installation, you have to actually be, if it's a good installation, you have to be in the space. And it kind of gave you vertigo, this piece. I wrote a proposal to have this, this is one of the grants that I got from Oregon, the Ford Family Foundation and Oregon Arts Council, but I used that funding to bring in 3 assistants, my husband, and myself to install this at the national conference in Kansas City. And this is them in kind of like the middle of the job, exhausted. But it was nice to have that funding because I was able to fly them all in ourselves, the work, and put them all up. But it took us like, I don't know, 3 or 4 days solid of installing this. And they look so seamless. They look so simple. And I feel like all the work kind of looks like that in the end, but their work. This is an image of the process of some of the Peaks and Valleys work. And this is a 50-foot wide installation of the Peaks and Valleys original work at Lewis and Clark College. And this kind of takes on these different metaphors. The idea of process is filter, like that slow process, and how we can kind of understand the world, or the idea of reverie through making. And so, this was all happening while my husband was earning his PhD. And so it's also about data. We're also living in a valley. But that's a detail of that stuff. And I was accused when I was in Maine of using white as a crutch. And so I started using color. It took me a long time to figure out how to use color. And so this is one of the earlier ones. This is like a direct piece about my mom being in the ICU. And the idea that when you're in the ICU, you're like staring at these monitors for data. And so this is the rhythm of a heartbeat, which you can see after I tell you that, I'm sure. But kind of abstracted with these colors and the overlaying. So we lived in the path of totality in Oregon. This is my dog. My husband finished his PhD in June, but then there were definitely several more months of working on stuff for that. We were packing up our house when totality happened, and we were able to store some things in our garage because I got another grant to go to Taiwan for a month. So we packed everything up. We went to Taiwan, and we were greeted with a basket of mangoes. And it was the greatest gift to be there for a month after all this craziness of PhD life for 6 years, and zooming around to residencies and whatever. So this is a guy at the mango market. This is the view into Taiwan. We don't think of Taiwan as one of the most beautiful countries. We think of it as a place with factories, maybe, at least from the 80s when I think of Taiwan, and label and things. But the middle of the country is a mountain range. So it kind of has like a backbone of mountain range. And the East Coast is facing us, of course, and the West Coast is facing China. And we were on the west side in Tainan. And what it gave us, and Taiwan's not very big, but what it gave us were these incredible sunsets and mountain views and the colors. And so I decided I didn't have long to make a show and to make work. Yeah, so this is a break, but I was really like a resident artist there. And I needed to make work. So I made a show called Taiwan Sky. And we did some traveling. We went to the East Coast, to the Taroko Gorge. If you ever go to Taiwan, go to the Taroko Gorge. The mountains flow into the ocean there. And we hope to one day live in a place like that. Like, it was such a dream. And I would make my tubes on the train. But this is the final installation. These pinks and purples and grays, they all have like a gray feeling to them, which was like the sky there. There's a detail. And then we came back to Seattle. So our flight was out of Seattle. We came back to Seattle and we lived here. And then like a month later, we went back down to Oregon and got all of our things. We had a week to find a place to live and a week before we started our jobs and residency. And in that week, we needed to find a place to live. We were staying with a friend. And we found a place to live where the mountains flow into the salty water. We live right by Golden Gardens. And this is our view. This is a 5-minute walk, or a 3-minute walk if I hurl myself over the rocks. We live right on the water with the mountains. And so this is starting to have an effect on my work. Here's a piece that I made. It's called Beneath the Surface. And this is actually a collaboration I made with a microbiologist that's not my husband. And this is a mountain range that's actually under the Mediterranean Sea. And you can see that these have like a topographical, a layering, and that you can see when you're to the side of them. So I was just curious to see what that would translate as. Okay, so this is actually what these look like. These are images from my show at Sierra Nevada College. And I named the show The Color of the Sky. And I wanted it to be like a physical manifestation or a touching of color. I wanted to communicate that. And I thought of these as like cyanometers, or this tool that was used like in the 1700s to measure the blueness of the sky. And so I wanted to kind of feel what that might be like. Here's a detail. And I started using like these super hyper pinks. My show was in late September. And so I was making the work, like some of this work was like late July, August. And it wasn't until we finally got some wind that blew the air out of Seattle that I realized that those pinks were coming directly from the color of the sun and the color that was coming from the sky, like those really like neon pinks and oranges. And so I still call this a cyanometer, which was weird to the gallery director down there because it's not any kind of blue, but it still relates to the colors of the sky that we were seeing up here. Okay, so I want to wrap it up just with one more poem. Well, first I want to tell you what these are. These are By the Wind Sailors. Have any of you seen these? When you first see them up on the beach, we would see them on the Oregon coast, and they look like broken bottle glass when you first see them. But they're organisms that float on top of the water. They're by the wind sailors because they're just pushed by the wind and the currents. And every once in a while, the currents like belch them out on the coast. Okay, I want to wrap it up with this poem. It's called Vaso Furtivo. To all that is superficial, unstable, to all that lacks foundation, arguments, or principles, to all that is light, fleeting, changing, infinite, to smoke spirals, wan roses, to sea foam and mists of oblivion, to all that is light and weight for itinerance on this transient earth, somber raving with transitory words, vaporous bubbly wines, I toast in breakable glasses. That's from Maria Eugenia Vaz Ferreira. Okay, thank you.
Do you have questions?
Yeah?
Earlier in this presentation, I saw a lot of yellow, like your studio was bright yellow, and you made many, 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 many lemons, and I'm wondering if you
Yeah.
know more about lemons and yellow.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because you're not the first person that's pointed that out to me. And some of my friends were like, oh, yellow is your favorite color. And I don't think it is. I think it had more to do with, I wasn't really applying color necessarily before. It was using the color of the thing, the natural color of the thing that I was using. So like, I was using a lot of beeswax back then. And you know, maybe I added some food coloring to the sugar, the cash sugar that I was working with, but it was probably to keep it close to the beeswax, to kind of keep it in a monochromatic way. And so really I think the yellow, I think that color was really guided by the material choices. It's interesting because now I'm like having to make choices about color, and it took me so long to integrate color into my porcelain because I couldn't understand how to do it. The way that people apply color often in ceramics is they apply a surface. And it felt totally inappropriate to apply a surface for my work. Like it had to be made of the color. And I think some of my first attempts I'm still in my first attempts. It's like, I mean, I'm only within a couple years of adding pigment to my porcelain. And so I think that they're coming to a place, that color is coming to a place where it's becoming more natural and it's making a little bit more sense. In some of this earlier work, I've just like had to go for it. I really liked seeing that pink and that bright orange because it feels like there's a reason that it's that color. And it's interesting. I just try to follow, sometimes I force it a little bit, like I know I need to go into color. I know that this is weird. I know that this isn't quite working. Like I just need to follow this through. And then there's those moments where that bright orange, that smoke sky, which totally affects me. I'm sure it affects you guys. Like, it kind of freaks me out. I feel really uncomfortable when we have that smoke sky. And so, but I feel good that it's being translated into the work in a natural way. I know that that's not the yellow, but it kind of goes into thinking about color. You guys have any other questions?
I was wondering if you've ever had moments in your artist career where it feels more, or where you're creating, but it feels more like work, and if so, what most felt like work to you?
Rather than creating? I mean, to be honest, it all is work. And then I think that there's some product after with the work. But you have to get to a point where you really like enjoy the work. And sometimes you don't enjoy the work and you have to do it anyway. But hopefully it'll lead to an enjoyable place while working. I think they're products. I think, or it's the result, or it's the effect, it's the, I don't know, leftover after the work is the thing that you've made.
I appreciate how you spoke about mentorship and critique and the influence, and I just wonder if we could speak to our students and all of us now about like what sort of role mentorship and critique play for you now in a postgraduate studio practice setting, and how you seek that out or provide it or seek it, or what your relationship with your mentors.
Oh my gosh, it's so important to me. I had this weird thing happen, it's like making me tear up. I used to talk to my mom every day, and then like when this thing happened, it changed. Like, I don't talk to her every day anymore, and I felt like I didn't have any heroes in the world, and I mean like women to look up to. And so I've worked really hard since that happened to find people to surround myself with. The woman I worked with was definitely a mentor, the woman I worked with in Arkansas. And I don't know if you guys know about the program in Arkansas, but the woman I worked with in Arkansas is like a major badass. Like, she's brought in like millions of dollars. And she was a bit of a mentor to me. But I don't know that I had it in this world where I was trying to be this studio artist. And so I found it in bits and parts and pieces from different people. The woman that I stayed with in Seattle, she was a random person that I was put together with through the university, temporary housing, whatever. She's my parents' age. She's almost 70. I admire her so much. She's kind of taken on a mentorship role with me. When I was teaching at the university, last spring, I made an effort to go for a walk with her once a week. And it's not because she's a ceramic artist, it's because she's seeing the world in a similar way that I am, and she's seeing the challenges, and she's been through the challenges that I've been through in a similar way. And then on the other side of that, I really, really, really missed teaching when I was in Oregon. And so I taught a little bit at the community college, and from that I actually gained an assistant. There was a student who took all the classes that I offered. And then she was like, what do I do now? And I thought about it for several weeks, and I contacted her. I sent her an email, and I was like, would you consider assisting me? And she helped me hand press like all of those lemons that were in that boat. But it was much more than that. Like, what do you do with your life? Mentorship. She would help me make the things, but and right now I have an assistant, a quote assistant. She'll put it on her resume. The other one put it on her resume. But I have one who, she was taking my classes and helped me make some things and wanted to learn more from me. And then she rented her own studio, and she was kind of worried about not taking my class again this term. And I said, why don't you just come over for the same amount of time each week, sit with me in my studio, and I'll help you. Like, we'll talk about how to fix your kiln, or we'll talk about, last week she was thrilled because I let her help me clean kiln shelves, which is like a horrible job. And all the glaze ran off these people's work. But she was thrilled because there was no other place in her life that she would learn how to do that. And so, you know, sometimes it's like, hey, you want to just do this thing with me? And then it's like, oh, what is your challenge right now? One week she said, all these people are getting all these opportunities. How do I get opportunities? And my response was, well, you need to, first, for next week, you need to give me an adjective. Like, what kind of opportunities are you talking about? And then once you have that, it's like you can work towards those. You can turn that like envy of others' opportunities into your goal, the things that you can work towards. But yeah, it totally feeds me to teach, and to teach through mentorship is what I've been doing since I left Arkansas. I don't know. Does that answer?
That's wonderful.
Okay, cool. Any other questions?
I don't really have a question, but it's just lovely to see that there is there's very little difference between the work and life. Sort of talked about that on the way in a different way, but it's like they're just so enmeshed, correct? Like,
I think that was something that I learned from Eva Hess. Because I think there was some quote from her that I remember when I was in graduate school. It was something like, work is life, life is work, or it was something like, and hers was completely intertwined in the way that she thought about things. And I was just like, that totally makes sense. It's not, I mean, it's kind of like the way I want to use color. Like, I want it to be not forced. I want it to naturally be what it is, and yeah, I don't know. Any other questions, you guys?
I have a color question. In your exploration with trying out color, are you making your own glazes? Are you taking?
So I don't usually use very much glaze. Sometimes I put it on the wearables a little bit, and that's a commercial glaze. But my training was all mixing my own clay and mixing my own glazes. So I'm actually adding pigment to my clay, and so I test all of that, and I mix all of those things myself. Yeah. Sure. Hi.
Could you just tell us again, I remember some of the names of the poets that you read.
Oh, sure.
Tell us.
Rainer Maria Rilke, and
What was the name of that poem?
I don't have it written down. I'm sorry.
That's all right. And Emily Dickinson.
It's a really famous one from Rilke. Emily Dickinson, and then Maria Eugenia Vaz Ferreira. I can show you the piece of paper that has her name on it, because that's a serious. She's you're from Uruguay. She was from Uruguay. Yeah. Any other questions, you guys?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Anybody who wants to come to the gallery afterwards, we have a couple minutes to do that. So